Do you read a lot of nonfiction? What's your favorite nonfiction book? Does nonfiction matter? These are all part of a tag called Nonfiction on BookTube. I'm going to answer all these questions and more coming up. Without nonfiction, there is no fiction. I really do believe that. I am Samuel Durham. This is a tag video. The original tag was created by Olive at a book Olive. Thank you so much, Olive, for creating these questions. And Olive has been the founder of Nonfiction November since 2014. Olive has also been a great evangelist for nonfiction, and I'm really glad that we got this tag because it's made me think a lot about, in a typical week, I read about 3 nonfiction books as well as a novel. I always have a novel on the go. How about you? Do you do that? Do you mix nonfiction and fiction? And I find that I read nonfiction faster than fiction. That's one of the reasons why I'm able to read a lot. Steve Donahue in his video said he reads about 150 pages an hour. I'm not that fast. I'm probably read about 70 pages an hour with nonfiction. With fiction, I am a lot slower, probably about 30 pages an hour. And the reason for that is that I like to enjoy the prose, the rhythm of a novel. For example, right now I'm reading Carrie by Thomas Harris, and he loves poetry. And there's a lot of poetic sentences in his previous novel. So in this one, I'm trying to enjoy that. So with nonfiction, I usually have a lot of books on the go. For example, this week, I'm reading the latest biography of Stan Lee. I'm also reading Edna O'Brien's memoir. And on top of that, I'm reading Joan Carreyrou's book Bad Blood about Elizabeth Holmes and the scandal surrounding her company Theranos, the biotech, the multi-billion-dollar biotech company that's been at the center of a big scandal. Elizabeth Holmes was someone I used to really admire. I found her so inspiring. She was labeled as the female Steve Jobs, and now it turns out she's not all that. So that book is fascinating. So I've got 3 books on the go. This is a typical week. And when I want to read a novel, I write one. That's what Benjamin Disraeli said. Disraeli, a British prime minister from the late 19th century, 1870s onwards, and he was also a prolific writer. He wrote at least 10 non-fiction books, on top at least 10 novels, especially Sybil. Sybil is what we call a condition of England novel or a state of England novel. Now, I love Disraeli's attitude. Don't you think so? Don't you think that's a good attitude to have for an artist, for a creator? So last week, for example, right, this is when the Benjamin Disraeli mindset came into play. I was on YouTube searching for a video about this decade and what nonfiction has been doing in the last 10 years. So I thought there has to be. So I put in keywords like nonfiction in the 2010s, nonfiction in this decade, and so on. And I didn't find any useful videos. So I thought, I'll make that. I'll make the videos that I want to watch, right? So I created a video called The Golden Age of Nonfiction, the best nonfiction books of the 2010s. And then I created a few questions, 10 questions, and that ended up being a tag video. And I thought that was a useful way to everyone else on BookTube who love nonfiction to have a discussion about it. So if you want to watch that video, follow the link. It's in the description. Now, that original tag video, I tagged at least 18 people. If you haven't been tagged, consider yourself tagged and go and do that video. I would love to hear. We would all love to hear your experience of reading nonfiction in the 2010s. And the type of videos that I love to make are usually to do with themes or trends that I would have seen in my reading. Then I will then make a video about it. So I'm going to make a lot more videos in the next 2 or 3 months. I love biography, but within that, I love literary biography and literary memoirs. And one of the reasons for that is to do with the fact that I have a hobby, which is studying the mindset of champions in any field, any profession. Success leaves clues, goes the cliche. And I really do believe that. So One of my favorite biographies of all time is Michael Slater's biography of Dickens. Now, I have read and reread this so many times. I got it on my main desk where I outline projects in longhand, and he's always sitting there. Dickens is sitting there cajoling me, goading me, taunting me, thinking, come on then, you think you're so good? Come on, show me what you got. He's there, sitting there. And I like having that because I have lived this book. I read a few other biographies as well. They're equally good. But Steve Donahue talks about these big chunky biographies because you can get to live through them and they're really substantial. And also I get to learn about the process, the writing process, the writing routines of a great writer, but also about how that writer faced the world. And I also like reading literary memoirs, which is more about how the writer saw the world, because right now this week I'm reading Edna O'Brien's memoir Country Girl, and I've been fascinated by Edna O'Brien since the late 1990s. She would always be on BBC TV talking about James Joyce and Samuel Beckett and a lot of other great Irish writers. Although she's from Ireland, she has lived in London for the last, I think, 30 years, and she's really fascinated. Always loved listening to her talk. And last month, I read her novel Girl, which is about the group of Nigerian girls. In 2014, you might already know this, 276 girls in Nigeria were abducted by Boko Haram, the Islamic terrorist group. And what Edna O'Brien has done is tell that story from the point of view of one girl. And it's a really interesting novel. I do have a lot of problems with that novel as well, but I admired it, and I wanted to read a memoir that led Edna O'Brien to get to that stage where she has abandoned her usual passions to do with Ireland and then gone to Nigeria to do the research and write that novel. And I was fascinated by that because this memoir was written in 2012, but it's still useful because she talks about the way, all the things that formed her. And in recent interviews, she talked about how she loved Conrad and J.M. Coetzee and how their novels influenced the writing of Girl. So I'm interested in that whole journey, the whole evolution of a writer. So this is one of the main reasons why our literary memoirs, literary autobiographies, and literary biographies. My favorite nonfiction book is any book of essays or literary criticism by John Updike, like Hugging the Shore Here or Due Considerations, More Matter. John Updike has written a huge mountain of essays since the 1950s. And what I love is that to me, John Updike is my go-to person whenever I'm feeling low. Now, here is the question that I have for you. In the comment section, tell me, when you're feeling low, who is the go-to writer who will always pick you up? To me, it's always John Updike. What I do is, the amazing thing about it is that he's written so much. Now, I'm not a big fan of his novels and short stories. I don't think he was a good storyteller. He wasn't even a good novelist. But Harold Bloom famously said that John Updike is a minor novelist with a major prose style. And I have to agree. And the great thing about having a major prose style is that that prose style gets to work with other people's work and other topics. And he is magnificent. And every essay is a feast. Every time I feel a bit low, I will go and any collection, I will just open it up, start reading. Within 10 minutes, I have escaped. Within moments, I have escaped into John Updike's mindset. And he's beautiful at describing things. I love cinema. One of my favorite cinematographers is Roger Deakins, who has filmed movies like Blade Runner 2049 and No Country for Old Men and Sicario. What Updike does in prose is the equivalent of Roger Deakins on film. It's just beautiful. He creates beautiful images with words. I also find his prose not just lyrical, but also so calming. He was an optimist. He was a Christian who really believed in God. There weren't many. He's unusual when compared to other writers of his generation, like Philip Roth and Saul Bellow. Updike was an optimist who was always happy. And that shows in his prose. So when I'm feeling low, I want to be in the company of someone who's quite happy, cheerful, and Updike is the guy. And this is why I want to read a passage that he wrote in the 1980s about another novelist from his generation, Joyce Carol Oates. And what Updike says about Joyce Carol Oates can be said about Updike himself. It is so, in so many ways, it is a self-description. Joyce Carol Oates, born in 1938, was perhaps born 100 years too late. She needs a lustier audience, a race of Victorian word eaters, to be worthy of her astounding productivity, a tireless gift of self-enthrallment. Not since Faulkner has an American writer seemed so mesmerized by a field of imaginary material and so headstrong in the cultivation of that field. She has, I fear, rather overwhelmed the puny, mean-minded critical establishment of this country. And after the first wave of stories and novels, most notably Garden of Earthly Delights and Them, crashed and swept away a debris of praise and prizes. Protective seawalls were built and a sullen tide set in. To answer this question, I think we should divide the word people into 3 different categories. So in the first category, we have non-readers, right? People who don't read at all. There are many people who don't read a single book, fiction or non-fiction, right? So that's the first group. The second group, let's call them general readers, right? These are people who do read every now and again. They might even read 10 or 15 books a year, and some of them could be non-fiction. And to me, these are the people who would complain about things like reading slump or having reading goals. And then we have the third category that we could call natural-born readers or natural-born bibliophiles. Now, the thing about the third group is that these are people who would read all the time. They don't even realize they're reading it. Stephen King is probably a natural-born bibliophile. He says in his memoir on writing that he will be reading all the time, even if he's at a breakfast table and there's nothing to read. He would read the back of the box. And I'm like that. I think Steve Donahue is like that. I think you might be like that. If you're a natural-born bibliophile, you're going to read everything. It's to me, reading is part of breathing. It's what I do. It's the same with writing. I don't even realize I'm doing it. So the idea that what stops me from reading nonfiction, there is nothing, right? And I'm sure it's the same for every natural-born reader. Nothing stops us from reading. We are reading constantly, everything and anything. We never get into a reading slump. We never get into, we don't need to have reading goals and such because there's always so much to do and so much to enjoy with words. Now, the second category, right, the general readers, maybe this is where most people fall. And this is where I think people do suffer from reading slump. And when it comes to reading nonfiction, there are obstacles. For example, nonfiction is such a broad category, right? So they might like reading celebrity memoirs, but they might not be into, I don't know, books about nature. So they join a book club and they have to read a book by Robert Macfarlane, for example. I mean, he's got a good book called Underland at the moment. This person joins that book club and realizes that, oh, nature, it might be boring. He or she might have all these ideas without even reading about it. Because nature writing, how could that be beautiful? But if you start reading Robert Macfarlane, you realize that he is amazing, right? So it could be that. So, and it could also be laziness as well. There are a lot of aspiring writers, novelists, the aspiring ones. They say they want to be writers, but they don't read a lot, right? Stephen King has talked about this. Bret Easton Ellis has talked about it in one of his podcasts that he knows a lot of writers, aspiring writers. But when you talk to them, they don't give the impression that they read a lot. And I know a lot of people like that. So I think it's a combination of having all these obstacles like laziness, but also with a lot of people in the general reader category, they go in phases. They go through phases, I'm sure. So there might be a phase where they're reading a lot and then something happens and they just go into a slump. Now, having said all that, there are people who, if you're suffering from low moods or depression, now there's a serious case whereby you might not be in the mood to read a lot. Reading requires a lot of energy, right? A lot of intellectual energy, a lot of energy of the imagination. If you are familiar with David Foster Wallace, Whenever he suffered from depression, when he went to these real slums, he couldn't read at all. He never had the energy to read much. And I think in his case, and I think people who suffer from low moods and depression, I can understand. I genuinely empathize with that person. So if you're one of those people, I genuinely empathize with you. But everybody else, and I think I have to say that the natural born readers, they will read a lot anyway. The non-readers, I mean, it's going to be hard to get them to read any book, right? I mean, you know that. But the big category is the one in the middle, and I think they go through phases. And there are lots of reasons why they might be put off from reading nonfiction. And at least 10 or 15 booktubers have already talked about this, and I think they all come up with good reasons. I can't add any more except to divide this section into three categories. I wonder what you think of it. Which category are you in? Are you a natural born reader, or are you in the second one? It's unlikely that if you're watching my channel, you're in the first category. The number one reason I love nonfiction is because I really believe that without nonfiction, there is no fiction. Without nonfiction, we won't have novels and screenplays and movies and the great TV shows. Next week, I'm planning to read the screenplay for The Irishman, the new Martin Scorsese movie. That screenplay is based on a nonfiction book. Now, I can't wait to watch that movie. So many great movies and TV shows are based on, guess what? Nonfiction. There's a lot of research done on this. Without nonfiction, we're not going to have that many novels. Without nonfiction, the imagination is just that. I really believe that. For example, let's look at Dickens. Harold Bloom says that Charles Dickens had what's called an aboriginal imagination. He was blessed with his amazing mind, so he can just create worlds and just describe things, right? So novels like Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, and David Copperfield, Dickens could have just gone into his room and wrote them. Right? He didn't have to rely too much on research. But when it came to writing a novel like A Tale of Two Cities, guess what? He had to research. We know that he had to rely on Thomas Carlyle's French Revolution, that book. That book became his Bible. He also read a lot of other nonfiction works to create A Tale of Two Cities. So we can really argue without a lot of nonfiction, there might not be A Tale of Two Cities. The same could be said about Bleak House as well. He had to do a lot of research, right? Now, you could tell me, well, that's okay for that type of novel, but how about fantasy, right? You don't need nonfiction to write a fantasy novel. But the thing is, an aspiring fantasy novelist, how is he or she going to learn about the craft of storytelling? It's in nonfiction. He or she might want to read Aristotle's The Poetics, Christopher Vogler's The Hero's Journey, Joseph Campbell's books, Robert McKee's story. There's a cottage industry of books about the craft of storytelling that a good fantasy novelist has to read before he or she can write a decent novel, right? Without that, without reading all that book on structure and craft, it's just going to be a ramble. I've been sent stuff like that, and it's worthless. It's not worth reading. There might be good lines, there might be good lines of dialogue, there might be good prose, but the person can't tell a story because it could be a combination that person hasn't got the talent for storytelling, or that person just hasn't bothered to learn to read a lot of nonfiction books about the craft of storytelling, right? Because without that, they won't be able to. Even if you want to write a sci-fi novel, you've got to rely on sci-fi science fiction book. Now, but how about Game of Thrones? Now, I was talking, a few weeks ago, I was talking to this guy about Game of Thrones. And I said, I said to him, do you know those books were inspired by history, real events? And he looked at me and thought, I'm an idiot. He thought, no, you mean dragons and everything? I said, no. I said, didn't you see that interview that George R.R. Martin gave to Melvin Bragg a few years ago? That is repeated quite often here, and it's probably on YouTube illegally. If you get the chance, watch it if you haven't seen it. Now, George R.R. Martin talks about how his novels were inspired by the history books of Thomas B. Costain, especially to do with the War of the Roses, right? So you can argue that without nonfiction, there is no Game of Thrones, one of the most game-changing, innovative TV series of all time. So this is why I love nonfiction. This is why nonfiction is the fuel for the imagination of many great novelists, screenwriters, and playwrights. We need nonfiction. It's like water. Now, I was already a fan of Trevor Noah. To me, he's one of my most inspiring people. I love him. And I already knew that he had written a memoir, but I wasn't planning to read it. But then last year I was watching a video of Jasmine at Jasmine's Read, and she was so enthusiastic about Born a Crime, that memoir. So immediately I went and got it, read it, made a video about it. You can watch it. And then I also read The Uninhabitable Earth. Steve Donahue was one of the first to talk about it. I think he might have been the first to talk about that book last year. So I read that this year, and I don't think, I heard about that book. This is the thing. I hear about a lot of books, but I might not read it. But then I might hear Jasmine or Steve Donahue or Sophie at Portal in the Pages would say something, and then I will go and read it. The best nonfiction book that I read recently has to be She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. I already discussed this book on my other video about the golden age of nonfiction. If you want to watch it, check the link below. I think this is the book that is going to be so influential in the next 10 years because this tackles so many important issues. And more important, I think every man in the world has to read it. If I had a son over the age of 12, I would make him read it. Now, instead of a son, I have a daughter. And I worry about her place in the world. I worry about her as she makes her way into the world. How are men and boys going to treat her? Now, I know she's strong enough, and I know she's so tough, like her mother as well. At the same time, there are always going to be men like Harvey Weinstein and others discussed in so many other books that were released this year. It's not just She Said that tackles this issue. There's a good book called Formation by Ryan Lee Dosti, which also tackles a similar issue. This is why I think I worry about this issue. I think every man should read it. This is more than just a book. This is about a movement, as you know. I don't have any reading goals for the reason that I already mentioned in one of the other answers, but I am looking for some suggestions or recommendations. I'm doing a bit of research about money laundering, especially to do with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and also the property market, real estate. So this is why, so if you know any books, especially non-fiction books to do with corruption, money laundering, to do with cryptocurrencies, let me know in the comment section, or you can reach me through social media. If you want to read a lot more non-fiction, listen to what Steve Donahue has to say in his video. Steve Donahue is the one who's given one of the best pieces of advice on this topic. I would add by saying that life really is too brief. If you don't like reading nonfiction, you don't have to. Don't force it. Because if you force it, then you're going to get demoralized. This is why goal setting can be problematical, because if you say, okay, I want to read at least one nonfiction book per month, that might seem reasonable. But if you fail that, and then 2 months pass, and then you're going to get demoralized. This is why I don't like setting goals like that. And also do things that you love. If you don't like reading nonfiction, you don't have to. There are lots of great novels and screenplays and plays you can read. Steve Donahue is the booktuber I watch regularly. As I said so many times before, Steve Donahue is the Dr. Johnson of YouTube. So, and every single day he's putting out a lot of videos that are packed with value. I learn a lot. He is inspiring because he gets a lot of reading done, and also he speaks his mind. And earlier I was watching a video, his video about nonfiction on BookTube, and he was saying he doesn't think much of Cormac McCarthy or William Faulkner. And I was so elated to hear that, because I don't think much of those two either. I think they're completely, wildly overrated novelists, and I have too much to say on that issue. So it was really comforting to hear. I nearly said Harold Bloom. I said it was really comforting to hear Steve Donahue say that he doesn't think much of Cormac McCarthy or William Faulkner. So even with nonfiction, Steve Donahue said over 80% of what he reads are nonfiction books. So he has a lot to say on that. So you might already be watching Steve Donahue anyway, or if you haven't been watching, go and watch him. The other person who could be an inheritor of Steve Donahue when it comes to passion and erudition is Lukáš at Totally Pretentious. Only 25 years old, he already speaks like an academic, he speaks like a professor. I think he's destined to be a professor at one of the top universities in the world, like Harvard, Oxford or Cambridge. I can see him like that. I like being in the company because he has truly lived a book, and he also has a particular passion for primary sources. So, and I like that because they can be challenging. Right, but he will go there, read them, and he's into philosophy as well. So if you're doing a degree, especially an advanced degree like a master's or PhD, it's good to watch Lukáš regularly because we are who we mix with. So if you don't get to meet with people like Lukáš in the real world, go and watch his channel at least once a week. So you'll get to be in the presence of a really erudite guy who could be the next Steve Donahue or someone who's a really formidable academic. And I also like watching Jen at Remembered Reads. She has a distinct and endearingly unusual taste in nonfiction. For example, a few weeks ago, she put a photo on Instagram about the Zinky Boys from Svetlana Alexievich. So I asked her why, and she said she has a passion for reading about forces that invaded Afghanistan throughout the last few centuries. And I found that really fascinating, that she has that particular métier or particular passion. And she has many other strands of interest like that. So I get to discover books. I think she was one of the first to talk about Elif Shafak's nonfiction book on BookTube. Although she didn't like it, that got me to read that book. And the other thing is, I've been watching these tag video to do with nonfiction on BookTube, and not many booktubers are recommending British booktubers. So I'm going to do that. I really enjoy watching Jasmine at Jasmine Reads, as I said before. Also Sophie at Portal in the Pages. Both are consistent in reading nonfiction. I get a lot of ideas or get a lot of passion to read the books that they've been enjoying it. So those are some of the channels. There are others, but I think many other booktubers have already mentioned those. I really enjoyed making this tag video. Thank you, Olive at A Book Olive, for creating this original tag. And now I'm going to tag two booktubers. Firstly, Rashmika at Rashmika Likes Books. She's based in South Africa. I'm sure she will have a lot of interesting and idiosyncratic views about nonfiction books, especially from South Africa. I'm also going to tag Dal Cecil Runo. She is a booktuber and an author-tuber based in Hungary. I am tempted to use the term visually impaired, but Dal herself uses the term blind writer. She is blind, but she is one of the most creative and inventive booktubers on this platform. She has a really imaginative way of using her disadvantage to an advantage. I really recommend you go and watch her videos and subscribe to her channel and give her support. She's very passionate about books and writing, and I'm sure she will have a lot to say about nonfiction books. Let's not forget, without nonfiction, there is no fiction. Without nonfiction, we might not have a new Martin Scorsese movie. Without nonfiction, we might not have half the TV shows on Netflix. Without nonfiction, we might not have had A Tale of Two Cities, Game of Thrones, or 50 Shades of Grey. 50 Shades of Grey. No, wasn't that based on Twilight? Twilight. 50 Shades of Grey based on Twilight, right? I think I'm going to reread Twilight. Don't judge me. Don't judge me. Look. They're good books. They're good books. I'm going to find the other two and I'm going to start reading. Do not judge me. Do not judge me.